Hey everybody, it's Space, the final cardboard tier. Here is a list of all the other cardboard tiers. And these are the 7th continent voyages of the starship Gloomhaven. If you didn't know what any of that really meant, then don't worry, I'll explain in just a little bit. But if on the other hand, it sounded trite and conceited, then we've just taken the first step to understanding why Stars of Akarios fundamentally does not work. Sort of. This is Stars of Akarios, an ambitious box of space toys from first-time designer Brendan McCaskill. In it, you will take on the role of starship pilots, hurtling through solar systems, doing what I imagine all starship pilots do, leveling up their abilities and looking for character upgrades. Ambition is an old tale in board games. Ours is a hobby of passion, and we tend to reward it. The bigger the idea, the grander the vision, the more backers on Kickstarter. In this case, nearly a cool million Canadian. A lot of people were willing to put some serious dosh to see this promise delivered. So then, what is that promise? Well, it's Gloomhaven, but in space. This sounds so cool. It's like an idea tailor-made for me. Look, I'm a simple man. I'm nearly in my 40s. I like tactical turn-based combat and I like space. Shocking, I know. I bet there's not like more people in my demographic in board games. But it's not just any tactical turn-based combat, it's Gloomhaven tactical turn-based combat, aka the game myself and Elaine all the way back in 2017 named as our #1 game of all time, and the highest ranked game on Board Game Geek, and the precursor to the highest funded tabletop crowdfunding project of all time, which me and Elaine designed a scenario for, which isn't really biased, but it's like something I thought you should know. Imagine having the stones, nay, the moons, to put your own spin on that. Well, it turns out even the moon wasn't big enough for Brendan, because here comes a galaxy brain level idea. What if we ship even more genres together and add 7 continent, another smash hit, heavily criticized by our channel, into the mix and let that be a thing. And just like that, we have the basis for a game of magnificent scope. You'll fly through space, engage in starship fights, explore mysterious worlds, upgrade your characters, discover puzzles. If I got something like that when I was 12, it would be the best toy I ever had. My very own personal space adventure. And this is where you say, Efka, that does indeed sound very juicy, but Brendan McCaskill is a first-time designer, and Gloomhaven and 7 Continent are both very big, popular games. Can he possibly succeed at combining them? No. Welcome to NPI Space Camp. It's just like regular Space Camp, except you can't wear an astronaut suit, there is no planetarium, and you have to learn board game rules. To understand Stars of Akarios, first we must understand space. And for that, we will need a lot of time. Get it? Because space and time are the same thing. Never mind, it's too highbrow for you. The framework of Stars of Akarios rests in space exploration. Here you'll move your very big spaceship from card to card, interacting with various places denoted by numbers that lead you to a big book of story. There's 3 different types of things you will find when you interact with a number. There could just be some story text with a choice that will result in either a penalty or a reward. There could be a scenario with an exciting space battle where you'll pilot your starship weaving through hexagons and pewing your enemies. Or world exploration where you land on a planet and once again explore a map composed out of cards, but this time in a more elaborate way. Hey, look at that! Space Camp is over. Anyone got any questions? You there, with your hand up. Yes, the toilets are in the corridor to your right, 2 doors down. I'm just kidding, Space Camp is far from over. There's so many more rules to learn. But don't worry, we're gonna start by putting our best foot forward onto the very stable surface of... The first element we're going to dissect is space combat, the game's strongest suit. When you start a campaign, you'll be asked to pick a pilot and a starship. Almost any combination is valid here because each of them provides statistics relevant to mostly world exploration or space combat. Also, they both have a mini that, and I can't wait to show this to you, docks onto your player board. Literally docks, because to be able to dock the starship, you have to flip over your stats. You won't need them when you're docked. And when you undock your ship to go into combat, you can flip the stats back up again. This little detail makes me so unreasonably excited. But it's not just that, because if there's one thing Stars of Akarios gets right, it's presentation. Or more to the point, how presentation reinforces gameplay. Everything you can do in space combat is right here on your player board. Want to pew your lasers? There's cards with diagrams that show you exactly where you'll shoot and what it'll do. Want to zip past an enemy fighter and do a hard 180 to bombard their engines? Look, there's a card that displays this specific maneuver. Other upgrades include pilot abilities, ship abilities, co-pilot abilities, and tech. Each has limited use, and that use is tracked by cubes. Also tracked by cubes is your hull, your shields, and stress. Wah wah sound effect. I'm sad now, it's too much like real life. Everything is right here at my fingertip in what feels very much like a pilot's control panel. I guess immersive is the word here, but I like to think of it as magical instead. The enemy is right in front of me. I press the proton blast button and kablam! I can see that Ronin scout through my viewport, drifting listlessly in space, its lasers reduced to a mere whimper that no one can hear. 'Cause it's space. You can't hear whimpers in space.
That's science!
Mechanically, everything's powered by dice. Each turn, you will roll 4 three-dimensional luck cubes that can then be placed on various abilities of your ship as long as the icons match. Movement results will generally power movement abilities, fighting results will pew-pew your pews, and stress results in more stress, predictably. But also, it's a wild result, because on stress, you can do anything. Just like how I wrote this video. In practice, it results into a tantalizing cat and mouse. Each turn, predictably, you will find yourself in space. But the thing about space is that there are spaces in it. And for something that is literally nothing, it can be quite tricky to navigate. Let's say you are facing a Ronin frigate, a big hulking mesh of unsavory looking hexagons that will surely obliterate you if you do nothing about it. Well, thankfully you have a weapon. But the trick is, that weapon will only do something if you can get the enemy into its firing arc. Maybe you have a long shot, something that can ignore the frigate's massive shields and deal damage directly to its hull. A few lucky shots out of that might just take it out, but uh-oh, it only fires in a straight line, and uh-oh, it won't hit anything that's directly next to it, and uh-oh, it won't hit anything that is too far away. That is a lot of uh-ohs to fulfill, especially in a game where the way you are facing is part of the puzzle. Anytime you execute a movement maneuver, you can only move along the pattern of the maneuver, but it also takes into account where you were facing to begin with. And rotating your ship is a luxury you can't always afford. First, it will hoover up one of your 4 precious dice. Dice you could have used to unleash extra damage or fire at multiple targets. Second, you can only rotate 2 hexes, meaning that if there's an enemy directly behind you, you're more likely to get in a better position by flying in a big loop, which makes sense. You're piloting a starship, not a dreidel. As for shooting itself, well, it's pretty simple. Your attack will tell you the base damage that you are dealing. Then you'll draw a card from your modifier deck, which could be, say, a +2, yay, or a -1, boo, or in rare cases, double damage, that's your crit. Or you could miss entirely. As you progress through the game and get abilities, you will be able to modify your modifier deck. Take out a -2, for example. That card is no longer in your deck for the rest of the campaign. Or add cards with bonus effects. And yes, That is the Gloomhaven part 141. It is, however, looser than its predecessor. It isn't structured in a rigid manner. There's no I go, then you go. Anyone can activate any ability as long as it has supply remaining. You can spend dice at any point, freely interchanging actions between players. Meaning, if you're in a situation where you can't quite gather your gunship in your sights, you can always ask your buddy to fly up to it first and hit it with its tractor beam. Now, not only can you shoot it, but also you're in its bottom arc, meaning you get advantage on your shots, meaning you are a lot less likely to miss. It's tactical, crunchy, and satisfying. The fun part isn't shooting at spaceships, it's figuring out how to get to the place where you can shoot at spaceships. You'll careen and swerve and manage to outflank your opponent. You put all your power into your lasers. Direct hit! Yes! Take that, you Ronin scout! And then you realize that you put your
astronaut
in front of 3 enemy fighters, and they will kick it. Once you and your friends have spent your 4 dice to power your ships, it's the enemy's turn. Here they'll draw a card from a dedicated deck, each type of spaceship having its own separate deck. The card will say where they'll go and what they'll shoot. And this is where it all goes wrong. Enemy behavior in this game is just a mess. On multiple firing arcs, there's a lot to be said about how clunky it feels to move these ships. Since facing matters and their movement is erratic and different each turn, you have to adapt to unintuitive visual patterns, figuring out which hexagon it is they end up in. And since most of this map is literally empty space, there's not enough visual clues as you pivot the card to match to the ship's facing and then readapt for the next 3 enemies that all face in a different direction. It just feels very nebulous. Talking of nebulous, there will be times when enemy fighters will do something stupid, like fly into a nebula, which damages their shields. And in games like Gloomhaven, where movement rules are much more defined, it feels great because you're like, aha! I outwitted you! Take that, you ooze! Here it feels unearned because you're not sure whether they flew into the nebula because they were meant to fly into the nebula, or you flew them into the nebula because you once again misunderstood how movement actually works, because the movement rules are not very clear. But that is just a quirk of the system, the price you pay for Gloomhaven in space. Except, despite the inevitable comparisons by me, every reviewer on the planet, and pretty much what the game markets itself on, I have to ask, is this Gloomhaven in space? Because whilst it does port over some of its systems, in my opinion, it ports over the uninteresting ones. Yes, the modified decks, character progression, damage system are all recognizable to fans of Gloomhaven, are adapted nearly whole cloth, and provide a good, rigid structure, but not the fun. Let's get back to enemy AI. Remember, I mentioned that each ship type has its own separate deck of AI cards. That implies that they have their own distinctive quirks and patterns of behavior. And whilst I can't definitively state that that isn't true, for example, the Ronin frigate has a big area attack that the Ronin scouts simply don't. But these moves feel so circumstantial and in the margins. They simply don't separate ship types enough, to the point where the 3 defining features are how much hull, shield, and attack they have, the 3 things that are not on the AI cards. The same can be said for player abilities. All of them are accessible to you at all times. You don't have to create plans and setups, you just have to push the button and fly, or shoot, or spin, like the dreidel. Meaning that the turn-to-turn puzzle isn't how do I maximize my abilities and actions. It isn't dynamic and shifting, it's just how do I shoot? And I could use up one of my abilities, but again, that's not dynamic. I'll just use another shooting ability or the default shooting ability. I have the need for shoot, and I need to move so that I can shoot. Not what to shoot with, not what weapon to save up for a harder enemy, just shoot. And that's a fine puzzle, but not sustainable over, there's like 150 scenarios in this game. Not all of them are combat scenarios, and you won't encounter all of them, but you know that James Bond intro where he walks sideways along the shot and then turns to the camera and then goes, kablam! Exciting, right? Well, play that clip on repeat for 100 times. See how you feel about it then. And you know what? That's okay. I did maybe say this isn't Gloomhaven for a reason, because that's not all this game is. It is Gloomhaven within the Seventh Continent adventure framework, so judging that alone would be foolhardy. Neither element was ever going to be the game's strong suit because the development for each of the progenitors took years and years. Stars of Akarios does not have enough time to be stronger than either. All it has to do is be competent at each of them. More to the point, at the beginning of this video, I told you that this game does not work, and so far all I've shown you is a game that isn't as interesting as it could or should be, but I did not show you a non-functioning game. And my argument is that it isn't functioning, and I still stand by that. Because once again, Stars of Akarios is meant to be a holistic experience, a melding of adventure and tactical fighting, and it is precisely this joint that holds the two together that buckles under pressure and collapses everything. But before I can tell you why, I have to show you the other side of this game. And now you're like, oh no, it's back to Space Camp. We're gonna have to learn rules again just so he can tell us that this isn't as good as Seventh Continent. And, well, it isn't, but that's not the point. The point is, it's really quite rubbish. The basic gist is that this is a choose-your-own-adventure style game, but instead of being just a book, everything is displayed on cards. You examine the artwork, find a prompt that looks interesting, and then read that prompt in the book. This could lead to a bit of flavor, maybe a puzzle if you're lucky, or advance the plot in some way, leading you to another destination. I do have a record of not liking this card-based exploration choose-your-own-adventure style game, a genre that, despite its popularity, only has a couple of entries. Probably because it's really hard to make one of these. So much effort has to go into art, writing, puzzle creation, and a tense system to hold it all together. Stars of Akarios technically does have all of these, but just the faintest whiff of each, so it can pass as functional. Here's where it gets really weird, because the explorative side of Stars of Akarios can be then further divided into 3 different types of exploration. One being the overarching space exploration, where you'll fly a starship and interact with numbers in the book, and that'll lead to scenarios, some of which could be space combat, and others could be world exploration, which can then further be subdivided into 2 different types that follow the same rules, but have a different purpose and scope. Let's briefly dip into the space part. I say briefly because it's dull and pointless. I'm not being hyperbolic because you're not exploring as such, you're just pushing this mini of the Sparrow that has the stability of a piano going down a flight of stairs across cards to get to the next mission. It does provide opportunity for random events or sometimes side missions not part of the main plot, but I feel like this could have been done without the need for me to tear down components and set up new ones each time I advance the story. The hitch here is that anytime the Sparrow moves or explores or does anything, it has to spend 1 supply. And if you run out of supply, then you start taking penalties for future scenarios, giving you the impression that there's a resource management situation going on here. I've played through half of this gigantic campaign, and not once did I feel the sting for the lack of supply, making this whole thing feel like a weak, wet slap. The world exploration has more rules. For example, you have energy that you spend each turn. That's the thing that lets you do things. And if you run out of energy, you start taking damage to health. And if you run out of health, you could technically fail a scenario. You also have 4 dice that you roll each round, just like in space combat, but here you roll them when you assign them to an action. How many dice you need to assign is displayed on the cards themselves when you choose what to explore, and it asks you to then roll certain results to succeed. You can assign more dice than the minimum displayed on the action to ensure that you succeed, but doing that means you might not have enough time to explore everything the adventure has to offer before your energy runs out. Problem is, most of your dice, meaning actions, will be eaten by just moving from card to card, forcing you to roll and move. But the only potential downfall here is that you might roll stress, which will add to stress, which once again, in no world exploration scenario, has felt like an actual penalty. So these dice here are just a restriction on how much you can do in a turn, and how many turns you have is restricted by energy. A mechanism that is important in what I will dub as little world exploration, but perfectly resettable in big world exploration. All of these mechanisms can be summarized as FAF, an elaboration just so these cards can exist, rather than any meaningful gameplay. You also have stats that sometimes add to the total result required when the visual prompt specifically displays that particular stat. And each pilot has their own suite, with future pilots you unlock offering a bigger total towards their statistics. That is sort of the rules, and none of them work. I mean, once again, mechanically they provide a structure that the game rests on so that it can be functional, but just like with space exploration, you'll wonder why you're doing any of it because it's not interesting. And without spoiling too much, the game offers you shortcuts so that you can circumvent the rewards that you get out of it, but then it still forces you to engage with these systems anyway. Let me explain the difference between little world exploration and big world exploration, which I'm not displaying here because visually it's effectively the same thing, it's just bigger, but also I want to avoid spoilers. It is also a contrivance because it's just a quest hub. You might encounter some characters, or if you're lucky, discover a side mission. And when I say quest hub, I am being generous. It's more like a quest fork if forks were sad and only had 2 teeth. The rest is filled with tiny, poorly written vignettes. Most characters don't even have names, just adjectives. A tall person, a short person, a curious person, a sad person. Descriptors. Maybe I should write my reviews like that from now on. A good game, a bad game, a tall game, a little game. Done! That's 4 games reviewed. No complaints. I'm not allowed to elaborate. I am being mean, but mostly because when I start exploring these worlds, I'm so curious as to what I'll find here. I mean, the whole purpose of having these cards, not just shortcutting through all of it mechanically, is to give you a sense of wonder. You're finding things, and that should be interesting. Instead, all I got was credits, because that's the reward for like 90% of them. The other 10% can be upgrades for your ship, or even new pilots and new ships. But I already get enough of that stuff from just like the general shops, or random space exploration events, or just progressing through the main plot. Whenever they announce a new actor to take on the role of the Doctor in Doctor Who, the British kids show that's way too popular for its own good, my father-in-law always says the same thing. I'm glad there's a new person to take on the role, and they look exciting, but it won't matter at all if the stories aren't good. Finally, we get to talk about the writing. No. Scenario design. Little world exploration uses the same rules as big world exploration, but it's self-contained vignettes, a dip into some flavor. And excuse me, but I would rather dip stale bread into vinegar than play one of these again. Don't mean that as an acquired taste, I mean they're disgusting. Not in an offensive way, just I didn't like them, but we'll get to the offense part a little bit later. They're just mechanically so frustrating. Each one has its own spin, but the only spin I feel here is my head turning and twisting trying to figure out who approved these. Never have I played a board game with such an acute sense that there is an invisible dungeon master masterminding all of this, who designed an RPG session solely to have fun for themselves, without a thought about the other 4 people at the table and whether they're having fun. They're not. They'd rather be scrolling through Twitter than indulge this nonsensical adventure. Again, not being hyperbolic, there is a little world exploration scenario where you could reach a fail state between the ranges of turn 18 or turn 3. What determines that? Some die rolls independent of anything else that you are doing. Roll a die, see if the scenario ends. I mean, that's good, isn't it? That's normal. Gonna take this opportunity talking about scenario design to dip back into space combat and my setting realization that this game might just be half-baked. As early as my 5th scenario, I got a big clue that someone didn't think this through when I played a space combat mission where my best bet at succeeding in a scenario that technically had no fail state was to do nothing. That's right, just fly away and hope that the cards come up right. I'm trimming away some details here, but that is the gist of it. Oh, and the bugs. There's more bugs in this game than an Adrian Tchaikovsky book. When Games got in touch with me to see if we wanted a review copy of Stars of Akarios, they did warn me that they were working on ironing out some errors, so I was primed for a game that wasn't 100% cohesive. But I was not ready for this. It goes without saying that the rulebook isn't great, but it's what they printed on the cards that's the real culprit. Some cards show effects that don't correspond to their effects as explained in the rulebook. For example, this card shows you that you can perform one of the 2 basic movement maneuvers, whereas the rulebook says that this card's effect is choosing either of the 2 basic movement maneuvers. And this is not the only card that does this. This co-pilot has one name on the front, a different name on the back. Of course, if you try to find that other name on another card's front, it has the other name on the back. Which one is which is impossible to determine. That's just a couple of the examples of the myriad of misprints that I found, and by the time I got to the scenario that is the same paragraph printed 4 times in a row, all I could say was, well, of course it is. To the credit of the designer, they are actively answering rules questions on BGG, and with a can-do attitude, you can put together the big picture. I'm mentioning this less to be like, oh, ho, ho, look at all these bugs, although do look at them, but to display the whole cloth of this game, which is that there is only half the cloth. The ambition of Stars of Akarios is the melding of 2 gigantic genres. The reality of Stars of Akarios is that the design team got a good start with Space Combat, and then, my guess, didn't have time to develop the rest of it. I think that's why I'm so disappointed, because if it didn't feel so half-baked, I think this would have the potential to be a truly memorable experience. Whilst I did complain that a lot of this exploration could have been abstracted, that argument ignores what the exploration adds: a sense of a universe filled with characters, locations, and surprises. And it is, but notice I didn't say cool characters or interesting locations or unexpected surprises. Those were the adjectives I would have liked to have seen. Also, as a side note, whenever we review a campaign game, we get comments saying, oh, it's just the reviewers blitzing through it and then they get burnt out on the game and don't like it. Please, I've done this reviewing log for a while now. Give me some credit. I know what I'm doing. I really took care to try and enjoy Stars of Akarios. I was excited for it. What frustrates me is how close this game feels, how inspired its ideas are. It's on the verge of not just working, but being one of the most interesting designs out there. I wanted to take these ideas from Gloomhaven and Seven Continent and use them as antimatter fuel to hyperspace punch into new unexplored territories. Instead, it uses them to prop itself up and trundle over the finish line of a three-legged race that other competitors have long finished and now have gone to get lunch, leaving Stars of Akarios alone, behind, and very tired. Blending 2 genres together means you're balancing 2 very heavy things on a tight rope. If both are meant to be the star of the show, if both want to stay on the rope, then both have to be as strong as each other. Stars of Akarios is far from getting that balance right. You'd think it would just topple immediately, but instead it just drifts aimlessly into the vast nothing. When I say Stars of Akarios doesn't work, I don't mean mechanically. Everything in here eventually Rube Goldbergs itself if you apply enough elbow grease. But the promise of Stars of Akarios was never mechanisms. It was an experience. And that experience is nowhere to be found. When I was learning to write in university, there was one piece of advice that was consistent between all lecturers. Read bad books. If you don't read bad books, you'll never learn how to write well because you won't be able to avoid the pitfalls of others. So this then is my final recommendation. Don't get Stars of Akarios. Unless you are interested in designing in this space and need to learn what not to do. Or you're so into board games that you don't mind buying a disaster for, let's call it, academic research reasons. Just don't buy it now. This wouldn't be the first campaign game that ended up as a mess. It can stand proudly together with Seafall, Gen 7, Discover Lands Unknown. All can be found in bargain bins for $15. And right now, Stars of Akarios is $170. Plus another $70 if you want the miniatures for the enemy spaceships, which is a fair price. It is aesthetically very nicely produced and there is a lot of stuff in here. So for research purposes, one day this will hopefully be a bargain. But for now, the only merit it manages to achieve is that it made me bored of space. Something I thought was genuinely impossible. And that is that. Now let's talk about why this game made me a little angry in a special new MPI credit segment we're tentatively titling Politics in Board Games. Whenever we touch on more sensitive subjects, we always get comments from people saying, "Leave politics out of board games." Well, I want all the people who've ever left that comment to line up and say it again because not a great show here for Stars of Akarios. Okay, I'm obviously being facetious. In a way, I'm glad that Stars of Akarios is getting political. If any board game setting deserves it, surely space sci-fi would be it, right? I mean, talk about a rich history of complicated subjects, from aliens commentary on corporate dismissal of the working class, to Dune's tackling of environmental issues, to more recent novels like Arkady Martin's A Memory Called Empire and its dissection of imperial sublimation, or Adrian Tchaikovsky novels and all the spider politics, or ant politics, or sometimes shrimp politics. Even when sci-fi isn't trying to be political, it ends up being it anyway, and the people writing it know that. Here is an excerpt from the acknowledgement section of a John Scalzi book, who is self-admittedly a Rockefeller Republican. As a second side note, I will also note that the title of this book, The Collapsing Empire, was not intended as a commentary on the current state of the United States, the United Kingdom, or of Western civilization in general. I thought it up years ago. It just happened to look like commentary because, let's face it, 2016 was a historically farted up year, and I can only hope that 2017 is going to be better. Because if it's not, it really is time to head to the bunkers with our barrels of beans and rice. Don't worry, John. Everything is peachy now. This is so very clearly someone who says they had no political intentions, but recognizes that despite that, his book is political anyway. Because sci-fi creates rich, complex worlds. And without politics, those worlds feel empty. So what does Stars of Akarios do? Well, in my short time with this story, I got treated to such wonderful ideas like military essentialism, and if we don't fund the military, then very bad things will happen. Dissent is the worst, and anyone who organizes against oppression are just thugs. Statues, on the other hand, are very important, even when they are built for very bad people. The establishment, literally the establishment, is great. but is mired in too much red tape and some other ideas that border slightly too close on real-world conspiracy theories propagated by creeps. Once again, I think I'd just rather scroll through Twitter. It is probably somehow less harmful to my mental well-being. I'm not even sure how much of it is intentional because so much of Stars of Akarios feels like it's just cobbled pieces from Star Wars or Star Trek or Starship Troopers, but not the Verhoeven Starship Troopers, the Heinlein Starship Troopers. And there's this line of both siding things that feels roped in as a defense mechanism when the game very clearly shows you the cards in its sleeves, because the rest of the world building and the characterization is non-existent. So this po-faced political drivel is the only thing that stands out. So congratulations, Stars of Akarios. You brought politics into your board game. And despite that, it's still utterly barren. Hey, you might be saying that was a very mean review, and you're right, it was. If you didn't enjoy that, I left a very positive video for you to watch. If, on the other hand, you did enjoy a little bit of deserved meanness, then here's a playlist of all the bad games we've ever reviewed. And if you really enjoyed all of it, then we have a Patreon, and you can always support No Pun Included by donating to that Patreon and ensuring that we keep making videos. We've got an exciting one coming up next, very soon.